Have you ever stopped to think about what really happens along the more than 3,000 kilometers that separate the United States and Mexico? This dividing line, marked by walls, deserts, and rivers, holds secrets that go far beyond what we imagine. It has witnessed wars, mass migrations, and today is the scene of a constant battle between dreams and nightmares. While many see this border as a barrier, others see it as a chance to start over. But what few know is that behind every inch of this border, there is an untold story, full of tension, hope, and mystery. Get ready to uncover the secrets hidden in one of the most guarded and controversial borders in the world. The border between the United States and Mexico is much more than just a line on a map. It carries the weight of centuries of history, political decisions, and the impact of millions of lives that daily cross or try to cross this barrier. On the one hand, we have the American dream, which attracts people from all over the world in search of a better life. On the other, we have the reality of a Mexico rich in culture, but also marked by economic and social challenges. This seemingly simple line became the stage for conflicts, stories of hope and despair, creating one of the most complex and fascinating borders in the world. This physical space divides much more than territories. It separates worldviews, political systems, and dreams from thousands of immigrants. At the same time, it also connects two nations that, despite their differences, are inseparable in terms of culture and economy. Think of Tijuana and San Diego, two cities that, despite their geographic separation, share much more than meets the eye at first glance. Stories of smuggling, immigration, and culture transcend this border, creating a web of curiosity about countries that few fully understand. To understand the importance of this border, it is necessary to delve into its history. It didn't start with walls or fences. In the beginning, it was just land, a vast territory shared by indigenous civilizations that did not know the concept of borders. But over the centuries, that line was drawn with blood, treaties, and wars, shaping what we know today. And yet for many, it remains more a symbol of division than unity, a physical barrier that reflects the profound differences between two worlds. This invisible but powerful line stretches for almost 3,000 kilometers and has witnessed crucial moments in the history of both countries. It saw the creation of great cities, the ceaseless flow of goods and people, and the political disputes that defined their course. But what few know is that behind every piece of this border, there are buried secrets, untold stories that reveal the complexity of keeping two worlds so intertwined apart. And these stories are often marked by events that still resonate today. Before any lines were drawn on the map, long before the conquistadors arrived, the land we now call the border between the United States and Mexico already had its own history. This vast region was inhabited by indigenous civilizations with ancient traditions and a deep respect for the land. The Spanish desire to expand their possessions clashed with British and French expansion in North America, creating tensions that would later result in conflict. What began as a dispute over uninhabited land soon turned into battles for control of valuable resources. The European ambition to control every piece of land shaped the future of Mexico and, consequently, the birth of the borders that would define the political geography of America. This colonization process created a harsh and irrevocable reality. The land, which once belonged to everyone, was now under the control of foreign empires. The impact of this echoes to this day, in the way borders were drawn and in the conflicts that arose from these arbitrary divisions. These early borders, invisible to the naked eye but powerful in their imposition, set the stage for the formation of future states and, eventually, the emergence of the complex U.S.-Mexico border we know today. Mexico, like many colonies in America, longed for freedom. For centuries, Spanish rule over the region had created a deep divide between the colonial elite and the native and mestizo population. The War of Independence, which began in 1810, was a cry of revolt against oppression, and the territory we know today as Mexico began to chart its own destiny. However, this revolution was not simple. It brought with it immense challenges, as the fight for independence meant not only breaking with Spain, but also redefining the country's internal and external borders. With the Mexican victory in 1820, the country finally gained its independence. But, like any young nation, Mexico faced great difficulties in establishing its authority and control over its vast territory. During this period, relations with the United States, a neighboring nation that was also expanding rapidly, were tense and uncertain. The two countries, although independent, were on a collision course. The territorial issue would be a constant, and Mexico's new borders were far from stable. Independence brought Mexico not only freedom, but also the challenge of maintaining national unity. The newly liberated territory was immense, and maintaining control over distant regions, such as Texas and what is now the southwestern United States, became an increasingly difficult task. It was in this context of instability that the first conflicts between Mexico and the USA arose, as the Mexican government struggled to solidify its control and prevent the American advance. The line dividing the two countries was still uncertain and in many ways fluid. Mexico, after its independence, inherited a vast land, but also countless problems. The relationship with the United States would become increasingly complicated as both countries sought to expand their influence. The tensions generated during this period of independence planted the seeds for future conflicts that would shape the border. And so, what began as a fight for freedom would soon evolve into a fight for territory with lasting consequences for both sides. In the first half of the 19th century, the United States was expanding. The young nation, driven by the belief in manifest destiny, saw its growth as a divine right to occupy all the territory between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This concept, deeply rooted in the American mentality of the time, generated a series of territorial conflicts and negotiations. For the U.S., Mexican territory to the north was an opportunity to expand its reach and power. Pressure on Mexico was increasing, and the idea of a fixed border began to seem untenable. Manifest destiny was not just a belief. He guided American foreign policy, encouraging leaders to look west, seeing lands like Texas and California as part of America's inevitable future. To Americans, this expansion seemed natural, but to Mexico, it was a growing threat. Tension between the two countries began to increase as American settlers entered Mexican territory, especially Texas, seeking to establish their own communities and ways of life. The border, once a fluid line, was beginning to become a matter of real dispute. Texas, then a Mexican province, became the central focus of these tensions. American colonists, dissatisfied with the Mexican government's policies, called for independence, and a revolt soon broke out. In 1836, Texas declared its independence from Mexico, establishing its own republic that would soon join the United States. For Mexico, this territorial loss was a painful blow, but it was just the beginning. Manifest destiny continued to drive American territorial appetite, and Mexico was about to face a war that would completely change the map of North America. Belief in the divine right of American expansion was the catalyst for a series of events that would shape the relationship between the two countries. Manifest destiny not only redefined borders, but also the balance of power in the region. Mexico, with its territorial riches, seemed to be the next natural target of American ambition, and the consequences of this belief would soon be revealed with the Mexican-American War about to break out, bringing to the surface the conflict over the true dividing line between the two nations. The year was 1846, and tension between Mexico and the United States finally boiled over into armed conflict. The Mexican-American War was a confrontation that was born out of the expansionist ambitions of the United States and the political fragility of Mexico. The American desire to annex territories such as Texas, California, and New Mexico has put the two countries on a collision course. What began as a territorial conflict soon turned into a war that would redefine borders and forever change the destiny of both nations. The events leading up to the war were marked by provocations on both sides. American troops crossed the Rio Grande, a disputed territory, and encountered resistance from Mexican forces. This was the trigger for the declaration of war by the United States. Despite the challenges, the border continued to be a symbol of hope for many. Even in the face of deportation, many Mexicans still dreamed of returning to the United States when the crisis passed. The Great Depression sowed the seeds of a complex and often painful relationship between the two countries, where migration would be constantly shaped by economic and political factors. And so, the border, once again, became a point of dispute, where the fight for survival prevailed over political and cultural divisions. With the start of World War II, the United States faced a new reality. As American men went to the front, there was a growing need for labor in essential sectors such as agriculture and infrastructure. It was in this context that the Bracero program emerged, an agreement between the United States and Mexico that allowed the temporary entry of Mexican workers to fill this gap. Between 1942 and 1964, millions of braceros, as they were called, crossed the border to work on American farms and railroads, playing a vital role in the war economy. For many Mexicans, the Bracero program offered a unique opportunity. At a time when Mexico was also facing its own economic challenges, the program was seen as a solution to unemployment in the country. However, despite the promise of fair wages and good working conditions, the reality for many braceros was very different. Long hours under the scorching sun, late wages, and poor living conditions were common. Still, for many workers, the hope of a better future on the other side of the border motivated them to continue. The Bracero program also had a lasting impact on the dynamics of migration between the two countries. Many of the braceros who participated in the program ended up settling in the United States, forming the bases of Mexican communities that are still present in various parts of the country today. Furthermore, the program created a relationship of dependence between the two countries with regard to labor. Curiosity about countries that offered better economic opportunities kept alive the idea that, by crossing the border, it would be possible to find a better life. When the program closed in 1964, it left a mixed legacy. For the United States, the Bracero program was a temporary but effective solution to a labor crisis. For Mexico, it offered an escape valve from unemployment, but it also generated a dangerous dependence on jobs abroad. Migration, which had been temporarily organized, would soon once again become a topic of debate and tension, with the border continuing to play its central role in the search for opportunity and survival. With the end of World War II, a new era of global tension emerged: the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union became the two dominant superpowers, and the world entered a state of constant surveillance. Although the conflict did not unfold directly in Latin America, the U.S.-Mexico border came to play a strategic role in combating communism, which the United States feared would spread throughout Central and South America. The growing presence of revolutionary movements in neighboring countries made the U.S. look at its own border with even more caution. During the Cold War, the border was militarized like never before. The American government feared that communists would try to cross into the United States, and immigration controls became more stringent. At the same time, the border also served as an entry point for spies, defectors, and political dissidents seeking refuge in the United States. Curiosity about countries governed by totalitarian regimes fueled widespread paranoia, and the border, which was previously seen merely as a division between two economies, now became an ideological line of defense. Border policy was also shaped by developments in Latin America, especially after the Cuban Revolution in 1959. Fear that similar revolutions would occur in Mexico led the United States to strengthen its alliances with the Mexican government, providing military and economic aid. Surveillance at the border intensified, and any sign of subversion was treated seriously. The Rio Grande, which separates the two countries, became a symbol of the ideological battle being waged around the world, with the United States seeing Mexico as a crucial ally in containing communism. However, the Cold War also brought greater cooperation between the two countries, especially with regard to trade and security. The border, which had so often been a place of tension, also became an area of collaboration in the name of mutual security. Although the United States continued to tighten its controls, Mexico remained a valuable ally in the fight against communism. And so the border, once again, played a central role in global power dynamics, reflecting the fears and hopes of an era marked by distrust and rivalry between superpowers. In the 1970s, a new war began to rage on the U.S.-Mexico border, but this time, the enemy was much more difficult to fight. The war on drugs declared by the United States started a conflict that to this day defines the dynamics between the two countries. As Mexican cartels began to gain strength, the border quickly became one of the main drug trafficking routes into the United States. The influx of cocaine, marijuana, and, later, heroin and methamphetamine began to fuel a crisis that would affect millions of lives on both sides of the border. With the increase in drug consumption in the United States, Mexican cartels have become the main suppliers, using the border as an essential corridor for their operations. The vast desert border regions offered countless routes for smuggling, and the cartels found increasingly sophisticated ways to transport their goods. Meanwhile, American authorities attempted to intensify surveillance and enforcement efforts, but the cartels' power and resources were growing at an alarming rate. Drug trafficking has transformed curiosity about neighboring countries into fear and distrust. Meanwhile, the demand for drugs in the United States continued to fuel the power of the cartels. The border, once again, was at the center of a global conflict, and the violence that began in Mexico quickly began to cross over to the American side. The power of the cartels seemed unbeatable, and the question everyone was asking was, how to stop an enemy so large, so well-financed, and so deeply rooted? Since its creation in 1924, the American Border Patrol has played a crucial role in securing the borderline between the United States and Mexico. At first, its mission was simple: monitor the border and prevent the entry of illegal immigrants, especially during the Prohibition period. However, over the years, this mission expanded to combat drug and weapon smuggling and human trafficking. As challenges at the border have become more complex, the Border Patrol has also had to evolve, adapting its tactics and resources to meet new threats. With the rise of cartel violence and drug trafficking in the 1980s and 1990s, the role of the Border Patrol changed dramatically. What was once a surveillance operation has become a real battle for border security. The number of patrol officers has increased exponentially, and new technologies such as drones and sensors have been introduced to assist in detecting illegal activities. Even so, the border, with its vast expanse and difficult terrain, remained one of the greatest logistical and operational challenges for American authorities. Curiosity about countries and the motivations that lead people to cross this line remained at the heart of the issue. High-profile cases of clashes between the Border Patrol and immigrants, or smugglers, highlight the daily tension that exists along this line. On many occasions, the border has become the scene of human tragedies, with lives lost in the desert or in violent clashes with authorities. For patrol officers, their work is seen as the first line of defense against outside threats. But for many immigrants and refugees, the Border Patrol represents a barrier to their dream of a better life. The border, more than ever, symbolizes a battlefield between hope and despair. The role of the Border Patrol continues to be a contentious issue today. While some defend increased security as a necessary measure to protect the country, others criticize the tactics used and the conditions faced by immigrants. The truth is that the Border Patrol has become an integral part of the history of this dividing line, and its actions will continue to be a central point in the debate on immigration, security, and human rights. What does the future hold for this force? This will depend on how the two countries continue to deal with the complexities and challenges of the border. Illegal immigration along the U.S.-Mexico border is one of the most controversial and complex issues in modern history between the two countries. For many Mexicans and Latin Americans, crossing this dividing line is seen as their only chance to escape poverty, violence, and lack of opportunities in their home countries. But this journey is far from simple. The border, which was already a place of tension, is now also the scene of a humanitarian crisis that challenges the response capabilities of both countries. Migrant caravans have become a regular phenomenon, with thousands of men, women, and children traveling together in search of safety. For these refugees, curiosity about countries that can offer shelter and opportunities turns into a desperate search for survival. However, upon arriving at the border, many are faced with an overburdened immigration system and harsh detention policies. The asylum application process can take months or even years, and in the meantime, refugees are held in precarious conditions in detention centers or makeshift camps on the Mexican side. The United States' response to the refugee crisis has been marked by controversy. The U.S. government, under pressure to deal with the large number of asylum seekers, has implemented strict policies such as the Remain in Mexico program, which forces applicants to wait for their hearings on the Mexican side. This has created a new crisis in Mexico's border cities, where thousands of refugees live in unsafe conditions, exposed to gangs and other forms of violence. The border, for these individuals, has become both a place of hope and despair, reflecting the complexity of the crisis. As the refugee crisis continues, the U.S.-Mexico border has become a symbol of the flaws and challenges of international migration policy. The humanitarian response is insufficient, and both countries are struggling to find a solution that balances security and compassion. The future of this crisis is still uncertain, and the border, more than ever, is at the center of a global debate about human rights, immigration, and the responsibilities of nations in times of crisis. What began as a search for security has turned into a political issue that challenges the fundamental principles of both countries. As the world moves into the future, the U.S.-Mexico border continues to be a powerful symbol of division and connection. What does the future hold for this dividing line that has seen so much conflict, migration, and transformation? For many, the border represents an opportunity, the hope of a better life, of crossing to the other side and finding work, security, and stability. But for others, it is an insurmountable barrier, a place where dreams of freedom clash with the harsh realities of immigration policies, drug trafficking, and militarization. The future of the border will depend on the choices the two countries make in the coming years. Issues such as climate change, economic crises, and political conflicts in Latin America will continue to drive migration flows. Curiosity about countries that offer better living conditions will continue to fuel people crossing in search of new opportunities. The big question is, how will the United States and Mexico deal with these growing pressures? The answer could define not only the future of the border, but also relations between the two countries and their position on the global stage. There is also the possibility that the border could become something more than a barrier. With cooperation and innovation, it can become a place of exchange and development, where the two countries work together to face global challenges. Building infrastructure, promoting more humane migration policies, and strengthening local economies can create a border that symbolizes hope, not despair. However, this brighter future will require a significant change in the way the border is viewed and treated by governments and societies on both sides. Regardless of which path is taken, the U.S.-Mexico border will remain one of the most complex and dynamic points in the world. She carries within her both the wounds of the past and the promises of an uncertain future. And as challenges evolve, the border will reflect the choices made by those who govern and those who risk everything to cross it. Will the frontier be a place of hope, where new beginnings are possible? Or will it become a place of despair, where dreams are continually dashed? Only time will tell. The border between the United States and Mexico is much more than a line on a map. It is an open wound and, at the same time, a bridge that connects two nations interconnected by their history, culture, and economy. Over the centuries, this border has been the scene of battles, dreams of freedom, human tragedies, and controversial policies. It separates two very different worlds, but it also connects them in ways that are undeniable and often surprising. What began as a simple territorial division became a representation of global challenges and hopes. This dividing line carries the weight of the untold stories of millions of people who cross it every day, legally or not, in search of a better life. It is a place where economic, social, and political disparities meet, generating both tension and collaboration. For some, curiosity about neighboring countries awakens the desire to learn, to connect, to find common ground. For others, the border is a painful reminder of the barriers that still exist between us. Not just physical, but also cultural and ideological. The truth is that the border, with all its complexity, is a reflection of the current state of the world. She shows us the best and worst of humanity, the ability to build bridges, and at the same time, the propensity to build walls. It symbolizes both dream and reality, both hope and despair. And as the two countries it separates continue to evolve, so will the border, changing to reflect the challenges and opportunities of the future. What can we learn from it? Perhaps in the end, it is the connections we create, not the divisions, that define us. And so, the U.S.-Mexico border stands, not as a simple line on the map, but as a continual reminder that the barriers we put up can be torn down, and the ones we maintain can teach us about who we are and who we can be. People like the Apaches and Comanches roamed these lands freely, living in harmony with nature, without the notion of borders as we know them today. For them, the barriers that divide did not exist, and the concept of nation was something distant from their daily lives. These people exchanged more than goods. They shared culture, knowledge, and beliefs. Indigenous civilizations built ties among themselves, weaving a network of knowledge that transcended any notion of territorial limits. The Great Plains and deserts were freely traversed, and the rivers, which today mark political borders, were seen only as sources of life. It is curious to think that in times past, this area, now so disputed, was an open space where people moved without restrictions, where curiosity about countries made no sense, as everything was a single land. With the arrival of European colonizers, all of this began to change. The land that was once one began to be divided and conquered. The desire for territorial expansion brought conflicts that transformed the dynamics of these regions. Indigenous peoples who once roamed freely were pushed onto reservations or exterminated in the name of progress. It is difficult to imagine the devastating impact this transformation had on those who called this land their home. The concept of border, for them, never existed until they were forced to know its limits. From that moment on, the seeds of division began to be planted. What was a vast expanse of land, rich in culture and tradition, gradually became a disputed territory. Stories from this era, though often forgotten, shed light on how the U.S.-Mexico border began long before any treaty or war. And it is from this pre-colonial past that we understand the roots of the tensions that would come to define the region in the following centuries. When European colonizers arrived in America, the land seemed like an immense, unexplored landscape of possibilities. But with the advance of Spanish colonization, what was once a vast free expanse became territory to be divided and conquered. Mexico, then called New Spain, saw its soil claimed and delimited by a crown that stood an ocean away. It was during this period that the concept of border began to emerge, not as a physical line on the ground, but as a political and military imposition. The Spanish brought with them the idea of possession and control of land. Colonization profoundly transformed the social and territorial structure of the region. The Mexican territory, vast and diverse, began to be segmented as the Spanish advanced towards the north. In the midst of these expansions, the colonists created the first settlements, establishing limits and rules. At the same time, the indigenous peoples who inhabited the region were pushed to the margins, their territories being slowly invaded and occupied. And thus, the first glimpse of a border appeared. Over time, borders began to be drawn more formally. Over the course of 2 years, fierce battles raged on Mexican soil, with the United States rapidly advancing on major cities. American military superiority was evident, and in 1848, Mexico was forced to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, ceding vast portions of its northern territory. The war left deep scars in Mexico, which lost approximately half of its territory. States such as California, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, which had previously been part of Mexico, were now under the control of the United States. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo not only redefined the borders, but also the balance of power in North America. For the United States, this victory marked its rise as a continental power, while Mexico was weakened, both territorially and economically. This conflict was more than a war over land. It represented a battle between two nations with very different visions of the future. For Mexico, it was a tragedy of territorial loss and sovereignty. For the United States, it was the confirmation of manifest destiny, the fulfillment of its mission to expand to the Pacific. But the consequences of that war still echo across the modern frontier, a line that, although officially drawn on paper, continues to be a source of tension and dispute. With the end of the Mexican-American War and the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, the border between the United States and Mexico was officially established. But what was once a vast expanse of land shared by different peoples now became a clear dividing line, a political and cultural landmark that would forever change relations between the two countries. This new border not only cut through Mexican territory, but also divided families, communities, and ways of life. What was once fluid and undefined now became a rigid and unforgiving barrier. This line, which stretches for more than 3,000 kilometers, crossed deserts, mountains, and rivers, drawn from negotiations between diplomats and political leaders. However, for the people who lived along it, the change was dramatic. Many woke up in a new country without ever having moved. What was once a land of free movement between Mexico and the United States was now marked by a legal border, and crossing became a matter of sovereignty. Communities that previously saw themselves as one began to realize the cultural and political differences that now separated them. Over the years, this border became increasingly militarized and controlled. At first, the line was just symbolic, but over time, the United States began to tighten control over who entered and left the country. Immigration became a central issue, and Border Patrol was established to regulate the flow of people and goods. The birth of this border marked the beginning of a new chapter in the relationship between the two countries, where curiosity about neighboring countries and cultures gave way to policies of control and division. The impact of that border is still felt today. It not only defines the territorial limit between Mexico and the United States, but also symbolizes the economic, social, and cultural differences between the two nations. What began as a simple treaty turned into one of the most tense and watched points in the world, with global implications. And as the world continues to change, that line, originally drawn on paper, has solidified into a barrier that reflects the challenges and opportunities that exist when two very different worlds meet. With the establishment of the border between the United States and Mexico, new opportunities arose, not only for those who wished to cross it legally, but also for those who saw it as a chance to profit through illicit means. The 19th century was marked by the growth of smuggling routes along the border. Goods, weapons, and even people began to be transported back and forth, fueling a parallel economy that operated in the shadows. Smuggling would become an integral part of this frontier's history, bringing wealth to some and tragedy to others. At first, smuggling consisted mainly of basic goods. Local inhabitants, who previously freely crossed the border, now encountered difficulties with the restrictions imposed by the new governments. For many, smuggling has become a way of survival. Weapons and horses were often transported from Mexico to the United States, while manufactured goods traveled in the opposite direction. Curiosity about countries and their riches aroused the interest of smugglers, who saw the economic differences between the two sides as a profitable opportunity. However, smuggling was not limited to goods. People also became part of this illicit activity. Individuals desperate to cross the border, in search of better life opportunities, paid high prices to crossers who guided them through the desert and mountains, avoiding border patrols. For many, this was the only way to realize their dream of starting a new life on the other side. Human smuggling was, and continues to be, a painful reality in the region. As the 19th century progressed, smuggling across the border intensified. Laws in both countries attempted to control this illegal trade, but with little success. The border, due to its vastness and geographic diversity, offered numerous crossing points. What began as a means of survival for local communities soon turned into a profitable industry that constantly challenged the authority of both governments. Smuggling, born of the needs and opportunities created by the division itself, would be one of the many elements that would continue to define the relationship between the United States and Mexico. The beginning of the 20th century brought Mexico a period of great turmoil. The Mexican Revolution, which began in 1910, was not just a fight for political change, it was also a battle for the survival of millions of Mexicans. The border regions between Mexico and the United States played a central role in this conflict. Many Mexicans crossed the border seeking refuge in the United States, while others used nearby areas to organize revolts and plan attacks. The border once again became a line of tension and hope for those seeking to escape the violence. As the revolution spread, thousands of Mexican refugees sought shelter in the United States. Cities like El Paso and Nogales became frequent destinations for those fleeing the fighting. However, the United States observed the situation with suspicion, fearing that the conflicts would cross over to the American side. At the same time, the revolution provided opportunities for some, such as arms smugglers, who saw the war as a chance to profit from supplying military equipment to both sides of the conflict. Curiosity about countries and their revolutionary processes fueled the interest of those on the outside. For many, the border was a gateway to a new life, but for revolutionaries, it was a strategic base. Leaders such as Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata used regions close to the border to retreat and reorganize their armies. The United States on several occasions intervened in the conflict, supporting or opposing different factions. The revolution transformed the border into a scene of war and resistance, creating a blurred line between American and Mexican interests. Each side tried to protect its own interests while the border burned with the intensity of the conflict. The end of the revolution did not bring immediate peace. The border remained marked by the scars of the conflict. For many Mexicans, the dream of a better life in the North continued to attract those who had lost everything. The impact of the Mexican Revolution echoed in the relationship between the two countries, creating new migration dynamics and control policies. The border, which was already a crossing point for goods and people, also became a symbol of freedom and resistance. And, like so many other times in history, this dividing line would continue to be the stage for challenges and changes. The 1920s brought a new kind of tension to the U.S.-Mexico border: the Prohibition era in the United States. With the ban on the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages from 1920 to 1933, the demand for alcohol remained, creating a gigantic black market. And where there was demand, there was also supply. The border became a strategic route for alcohol smuggling, with traders and criminals crossing the deserts and rivers that divided the two nations to supply speakeasies and American gangsters. It was a game of cat and mouse, where profit and risk went hand in hand. Mexican cities close to the border, such as Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez, flourished during this period. They became popular destinations for Americans looking to escape the restrictions of prohibition, offering bars, clubs, and casinos that attracted thousands of tourists. At the same time, criminal gangs took advantage of the vast expanse of the border to smuggle alcohol en masse into the United States. Organized crime took hold, with notorious figures like Al Capone utilizing smuggling routes to profit from America's thirst for alcoholic beverages. Curiosity about countries without bans fueled the flow of visitors. This period also saw the strengthening of the relationship between American organized crime and Mexican smugglers. With the Border Patrol still in its infancy, it was relatively easy to move large quantities of alcohol across desert routes. Alcohol cartels, as they were called, emerged, and the border became a vital point for this illicit trade. Although prohibition was repealed in 1933, the legacy of alcohol smuggling left a deep mark on the region. Cementing the border, the war on drugs also had devastating consequences for Mexico. Violence between cartels, which competed for control of trafficking routes, increased dramatically. Border cities like Ciudad Juarez and Tijuana have become war zones, with mass murders, kidnappings, and extortion becoming part of everyday life. The Mexican government, often unable to contain the violence, has seen its police and military forces corrupted by the cartels. Drug trafficking destroyed entire communities, and the border once again became the epicenter of a conflict that seemed impossible to resolve. Despite the efforts of both countries to contain drug trafficking, the war on drugs remains an endless struggle. The U.S.-Mexico border, once a simple geographic divide, is now the scene of a global conflict involving billions of dollars and thousands of lives lost. Drug trafficking shaped the image of the border, making it synonymous with violence, corruption, and fear. And as the cartels continue to evolve their tactics, the question that remains is, how far can this war go? And what will be the future of the relationship between the two countries as the conflict drags on? The rise of the Mexican cartels marked a radical shift in the dynamics of the U.S.-Mexico border. In the 1980s and 1990s, the power of the cartels consolidated, transforming criminal organizations into international empires. Groups such as the Sinaloa Cartel, the Juarez Cartel, and the Gulf Cartel took control of trafficking routes, creating a network of corruption and violence that reached the highest levels of the Mexican government and security forces. The border, already a point of tension, was now turning into a battleground between the cartels, authorities, and the citizens caught in the middle. What started as a smuggling operation turned into a war for power. Cartels not only controlled drug trafficking, they dominated entire regions, imposing their own laws and regulating the lives of local communities. In cities like Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez, cartels operated with impunity, and any attempt to resist was quickly crushed. Violence has become part of everyday life, with public executions and forced disappearances. For many, curiosity about countries like Mexico soon gave way to a constant fear of crossing the border. Violence between cartels was not just directed at rivals. Anyone who opposed his power, police, journalists, activists, became a target. Kidnapping and extortion have become common tools of intimidation. Life in the border regions became marked by the constant fear of being a victim of the war between the cartels. And all the while, the Mexican government, despite its efforts, often seemed powerless to contain the violence. Corruption in the police and military only worsened the situation, allowing the cartels to operate with relative freedom. This violence also had a significant impact on relations between Mexico and the United States. American authorities pressured the Mexican government to intensify efforts to combat the cartels, but results were limited. Illegal immigration is not just a matter of numbers. It involves stories of courage, desperation, and, often, tragedy. The border, which separates two very different worlds, is seen by many as a door to the American dream. But it can also be an implacable barrier. The roots of illegal immigration are deeply connected to economic and social inequalities between the United States and Mexico. The difference in opportunities between the two sides of the border is the main driver that drives thousands of people to risk their lives to cross it. However, illegal immigration is a layered issue. It involves not only those seeking a better life, but also human traffickers, smuggling networks, and strict immigration policies that hinder the legalization process. Curiosity about countries and their disparities fuels the desire to migrate, but also generates intense debates about how to deal with the migratory flow. For many, the crossing is an experience marked by fear and uncertainty. Harsh desert conditions, border patrols, and human traffickers create a dangerous environment where failure can mean death. Even those who manage to cross face immense challenges when settling in the United States, with the constant fear of deportation and difficulties in finding work and basic services. Illegal immigration is a cycle that reflects the struggle for survival, but also reveals the failures of both countries to deal humanely and effectively with the migration issue. Illegal immigration continues to be a problem with no easy solution. As the United States seeks to secure its borders, economic and social pressure in Mexico and other Latin American countries continues to push people north. The issue of illegal immigration goes beyond control policies. It involves a web of factors ranging from global economic conditions to human rights. And as long as this dividing line continues to be seen as a way out for those seeking a better life, illegal immigration will be an issue that will continue to challenge both nations. The American dream is a concept that attracts immigrants from all parts of the world, especially those living south of the U.S.-Mexico border. For many, this idea of freedom, prosperity, and personal success represents hope to transform their lives. But is the American dream, in fact, an achievable reality for everyone? Or is it an illusion? For the thousands who cross the border in search of a better life, this question takes on profound meaning. Crossing to the United States is often seen as a chance to break out of poverty and offer a promising future to subsequent generations. For some, the American dream actually comes true. Stories of immigrants who arrived with nothing and, through hard work, managed to build successful careers and provide stability for their families are common. These narratives of overcoming keep alive the hope that, when crossing the border, opportunities will be available to everyone. However, what these stories often don't show are the difficulties faced along the way. The struggle to become legal, discrimination, undervalued jobs, and the linguistic and cultural barriers that many encounter. Curiosity about countries and their promises of success motivates the crossing, but the path is often full of obstacles. For many, the American dream remains out of reach. Despite the sacrifices, many immigrants discover that life in the United States can be just as challenging as the one they left behind. Low-paying jobs, precarious housing conditions, and the constant fear of deportation are part of the reality of many illegal immigrants. The dream of a successful life can turn into a daily struggle to survive. The promise of prosperity, for many, proves to be an illusion, as they try to balance expectations with the harsh reality of being an undocumented immigrant. Still, the American dream continues to be a beacon of hope for those seeking a better life. It represents more than material wealth. It symbolizes freedom of choice, the chance to build something of your own. And as long as there is hope, there will be those willing to risk everything to cross the border in pursuit of that dream. The question, however, remains: to what extent is the American dream a reality? And how much of it is just an idealized construction of a future that many will never be able to achieve? The border cities between Mexico and the United States are true points of cultural fusion. Places like Tijuana in Mexico and San Diego in the United States exemplify the impact that the proximity between the two nations has on their populations. Along the border, the two sides share more than just a dividing line. They share a rich mix of influences ranging from cuisine to music and language. The result is a unique identity, where curiosity about neighboring countries transforms into a binational culture, which often ignores the limits imposed by political borders. These cities function as portals for cultural exchange. On the one hand, the American lifestyle attracts many Mexicans looking for work, education, or simply new products and trends. On the other, the vibrant Mexican culture brings a touch of color, rhythm, and flavor to the daily lives of American cities close to the border. Tijuana and San Diego, for example, although they are cities from different countries, maintain a relationship of economic and social interdependence that is reflected in the lives of their inhabitants. The border, instead of separating, creates a bridge where the two cultures coexist and enrich each other. However, this cultural fusion is not always harmonious. Tension between the two cultures is also present, especially on issues of immigration and security. While many Americans see border cities as a symbol of the opportunities and challenges of globalization, others perceive them as a point of vulnerability where drug trafficking and illegal immigration can flourish. Still, cultural exchange in border regions is undeniable. From typical Mexican foods being served in American restaurants to binational festivals that celebrate the traditions of both countries, border cities are a microcosm of what happens when two nations collide culturally. The cultural richness of these cities not only reflects the impact of geographic proximity, but also serves as a reminder that political borders cannot impede the natural flow of ideas, customs, and traditions. Curiosity about neighboring countries continues to shape the identities of these communities, where Mexican and American culture intertwine so deeply that it is difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. The border, for many, is not a barrier, but rather a point of connection, where the best of two cultures meet and prosper. At the beginning of the 21st century, the militarization of the U.S.-Mexico border became an inescapable reality. With the attacks of September 11, national security became the United States' top priority. The border, which already faced problems with illegal immigration and drug trafficking, has now come to be seen as a possible gateway for terrorist threats. The response was swift. Walls were erected, the number of Border Patrol agents was vastly expanded, and surveillance technologies such as drones and motion sensors were introduced to monitor every inch of that dividing line. This militarization created a new dynamic in the relationship between the two countries. For the United States, the border has become a strategic control point, not only to prevent illegal immigration, but also to contain drug smuggling and possible threats to national security. For Mexico, this growing military presence represented both political pressure and an economic burden, as many of the security measures impacted trade and tourism in border regions. Curiosity about neighboring countries, which previously drove cultural and economic exchange, now gave way to fear and distrust. With militarization also came controversies. Many critics argue that increased border security has not solved the problems it set out to combat. On the contrary, in some areas, it has only intensified human and drug trafficking as smugglers have adapted their tactics. The construction of walls, for example, although symbolically powerful, has failed to deter illegal activities, which now occur through underground tunnels or in areas where the military presence is less intense. The militarization of the border, although seen as a solution, brought with it new challenges. Still, the impact of militarization goes beyond security policy. It directly affected the lives of people living in the border regions. Families that once regularly crossed the border to visit relatives, work, or study now face long inspection lines, increased surveillance, and an environment of constant suspicion. What began as a protective measure has evolved into a complex system of control that influences every aspect of life along the border. And as the 21st century progresses, the question remains whether this militarization will bring the peace and security so sought after, or whether it will only deepen divisions between the two countries. The wall on the border between the United States and Mexico is perhaps the most powerful and divisive symbol of the relationship between the two nations. Its construction, which began at the end of the 20th century and intensified during the Donald Trump administration, generated heated debates about immigration, security, and the values that the United States defends. For some, the wall represents protection against illegal immigration, drug trafficking, and other security threats. For others, it is a symbol of exclusion, of division, a physical barrier that reinforces the idea that two worlds cannot coexist peacefully. The symbolism of the wall goes far beyond its concrete and steel structures. It represents a mentality of isolation, of building barriers instead of bridges. For immigrants and those living in border communities, the wall is a constant reminder of the divisions that exist not only between countries, but also between people. The curiosity about neighboring countries, which once fueled cultural exchange, was replaced by constant vigilance, where the simple act of crossing a border legally became an experience surrounded by distrust and fear. But despite all the controversy, the wall also carries a practical reality. It is not infallible. Smugglers and illegal immigrants continue to find ways around it, whether through tunnels, boats, or areas not covered by construction. For many critics, the wall is a simplistic solution to much deeper problems, such as the economic and social inequalities that drive migration. While the debate over its effectiveness continues, the wall has already left its mark on the history of the border, being a physical and symbolic presence that shapes interactions between the two countries. The future of the wall is still uncertain. Some defend its expansion, believing it is essential to national security. Others call for his removal, arguing that he only serves to increase tensions and divisions. What is undeniable, however, is that the wall on the U.S.-Mexico border has already become an inextricable part of the region's physical and political landscape. It reflects both hopes for protection and fears of exclusion. And while debates about its construction and maintenance continue, the reality is that the wall already plays a crucial role in how the two countries view each other and interact. Drug trafficking is one of the most powerful and devastating forces that has shaped the history of the U.S.-Mexico border. Since the end of the 20th century, drug trafficking has transformed this region into an epicenter of violence, corruption, and conflict. Mexican cartels, responsible for controlling most of the drug trafficking routes that cross the border, have built empires based on exporting cocaine, heroin, marijuana, and methamphetamines to the United States. The border, once a point of trade and cultural exchange, has become a battle line between cartels and law enforcement. For the United States, drug trafficking represents a direct threat to the health and safety of the population. Millions of Americans have been affected by drug addiction, fueling a constant demand that cartels rush to fill. Curiosity about neighboring countries, which could have been a point of rapprochement, was replaced by a constant fear that drugs and violence would cross the border. The U.S. government's response has been to intensify surveillance and combat trafficking, but the results have been mixed. Drug trafficking is a fluid, adaptable enemy that takes advantage of flaws in the system to continue operating. On the Mexican side, the effects of drug trafficking were even more devastating. Border cities such as Ciudad Juarez and Tijuana have been deeply impacted by cartel violence, which competes for control of trafficking routes. Murders, kidnappings, and extortion have become part of everyday life, with thousands of lives lost in a war that seems to have no end. Drug trafficking has corrupted entire institutions, from the police to the highest levels of government. For many Mexicans, the border is synonymous with despair, where the fight for survival is marked by an endless cycle of violence and poverty. Although efforts to combat drug trafficking continue, the border remains a strategic point for cartels. They exploit every weakness in defenses, from using sophisticated tunnels to subverting corrupt officials. Drug trafficking, more than any other factor, has shaped the perception that the two countries have of the border. For some, it is a battlefield where good and evil face each other. For others, it is a reflection of global inequalities, where the demand for drugs and the supply of violence meet. The future of this struggle remains uncertain, but its impact has already left deep scars in the history of the border. In recent years, one of the most worrying aspects of the migration crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border has been the increase in child migration. Children, often unaccompanied, risk their lives to cross this divide, fleeing violence, poverty, and unsustainable conditions in their home countries, especially in Central America. This growing flow of minors has raised profound humanitarian questions, exposing the flaws in both countries' immigration systems and revealing the desperation of families who see the border as the only hope for a better future for their children. The reasons behind this migration are complex. Gang violence, lack of economic opportunities, and the collapse of public institutions in countries like Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador force many families to make the difficult decision to send their children on dangerous journeys to the United States. Curiosity about countries like the USA, where there is the promise of safety and opportunities, contrasts sharply with the reality of a crossing full of dangers, where minors face not only the difficulties of the desert, but also human traffickers and detention policies, each increasingly rigid. Upon arriving at the border, many of these children end up being detained by American authorities and taken to detention centers. Conditions in these centers have been the target of harsh criticism, with reports of overcrowding, lack of basic care, and separation of families. The humanitarian crisis generated by child migration has placed the border at the center of the global debate on human rights. The dilemma that remains is how to balance national security with the need to protect children arriving at the border seeking refuge. Each of these children carries a story of despair, and the border for them represents both a barrier and a chance for survival. The humanitarian dilemma of child migration has no easy solution. As the United States tries to strengthen its immigration policies and increase border security, the flow of desperate children and families continues. What began as an isolated phenomenon has now turned into an issue of international politics. The border, already a place of tension, is now also a symbol of the fight for human rights and the need for a more compassionate approach to dealing with migration. The future of these children and their families is at stake, and the response of both countries will determine the fate of entire generations. Juarez, Mexico, and El Paso, United States, are perfect examples of twin cities that share much more than a borderline. Separated by the Rio Grande, these two cities live a unique binational reality, where the daily flow of people, goods, and cultures is constant. For many inhabitants of these regions, the border is an inseparable part of their lives, a symbol of division, but also of connection. Curiosity about neighboring countries is experienced daily as families and businesses cross this invisible line, connecting two different but deeply interdependent worlds. In Juarez and El Paso, the border is fluid. Thousands of people cross from one place to another every day to work, study, or visit family. The economic and social differences are clear. El Paso is a prosperous American city, while Juarez, for many years, has struggled with drug trafficking, violence, and poverty. However, despite these differences, the two cities share an economic and cultural interdependence. Many factories in Juarez, known as maquiladoras, provide jobs for thousands of Mexicans, while American consumers depend on products made there. Daily life in these twin cities reflects the complexity of the U.S.-Mexico border. While there is cooperation and integration between the two, there are also significant challenges. Security is a constant concern, especially in Juarez, which was one of the most violent cities in the world due to the war between drug cartels. The presence of strictly controlled border patrols, walls, and ports of entry also affects the lives of residents, who have to deal with long waiting times and inspections when crossing the border. Still, Juarez and El Paso remain a symbol of resilience and adaptation. Despite physical and political barriers, these twin cities continue to prosper, showing that despite differences, ties between both sides of the border are strong. The curiosity about neighboring countries, expressed in the daily interactions between their inhabitants, is proof that even in a world divided by borders, human connection transcends these lines. What does the future hold for these cities? This will depend on how the two countries continue to balance security, trade, and cooperation across this complex region. Donald Trump's presidency has brought the issue of immigration and security on the U.S.-Mexico border to the center of national and international debate. From the start of his campaign, Trump promised to build a wall along the entire border, a move that symbolized his vision of protecting the United States from illegal immigration and drug trafficking. His tough rhetoric and restrictive immigration policies generated polarized reactions. For some, he was a defender of national security. For others, he was promoting division and xenophobia. The impact of these policies was felt deeply in communities along the border. One of the most controversial policies implemented during the Trump administration was the separation of immigrant families at the border. Zero tolerance for illegal border crossers resulted in the detention of thousands of children who were separated from their parents and placed in detention centers. Images of these separations sparked global outrage and increased criticism of U.S. immigration policies. For many, curiosity about foreign countries has given way to fear of an America that is less welcoming and more closed to the world. Another significant measure was the increased deportation of undocumented immigrants, regardless of their personal circumstances. During the Trump administration, the number of deportations grew, impacting entire communities that had settled in the United States years ago. The constant presence of immigration agents and the fear of deportation have become part of everyday life for many immigrants, both legal and illegal. The result was a climate of fear, which not only affected the lives of immigrants, but also harmed local economies and the cultural exchange that has always marked the border. Although Trump has left office, the legacy of his border policies continues to influence American immigration policy. The construction of the wall is still a point of contention, and many of the measures implemented during his presidency remain in place. Border communities, which have always depended on the constant flow of people and goods between the two countries, are still dealing with the consequences of these changes. The impact of Trump's border policies is undeniable, and their repercussions will continue to shape the relationship between the United States and Mexico for years to come. In recent years, the U.S.-Mexico border has become a critical crossing point for thousands of refugees fleeing political crises, violence, and extreme poverty, especially in Central America. Countries like Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, beset by gang violence, political instability, and economic collapse, have seen a mass exodus of their citizens who have ventured on long and dangerous journeys to seek asylum in the United States.
Hey explorers, if you love discovering the amazing curiosities and stories we share here on Exploring Nations, how about supporting the channel with just $1? This small gesture can make a big difference and is essential to keep this content going. Without your support, our journey might be cut short. And there's more. When you shop on Amazon, use our special link. It costs you nothing extra, plus you get an exclusive discount and it helps us out a lot. The links for donations and Amazon are pinned in the first comment. Don't let this adventure stop, we're counting on you. Subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and drop us a comment.